As we close out last week's discussion on Abraham and Joseph, what I want to focus on right here is specifically the question on Abraham, because I think it's an interesting one. And I think that if we miss the point of Abraham in his life and what Genesis is trying to teach us about that, then we miss a lot of not only Genesis, but the rest of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is very much about Moses, yes, but it can also be characterized as the story of the fulfillment and partial unfulfillment of the promises that are given to Abraham. So I think focusing on his life and focusing on the lessons that Genesis wants us to draw from them can be very important and is very important. In fact, the lessons that we get from the Joseph narrative are directly related to that of Abraham. So I want to focus just a little bit on Abraham and Abraham's life. If we look at the promise given to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, we see that the Lord said, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, or the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you all families of the earth will be blessed." Essentially, we have three basic promises. The first is a promise of land, that he's going to give Abraham a land which he'll show him. The second is the promise of seed. I will make you into a great nation. And the third is a promise of a relationship that's characterized by blessing and curse. That God will have a relationship with Abraham and with his people. He will bless those who bless Abraham. He will curse those who curse Abraham. And through Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So this is a relationship that God is promising through that's characterized by blessing and curse. And those are the three essential promises that God gives to Abram. And it is throughout the rest of Abram's life that these promises play up. We see that the question of the seed is a very important question, that by the time we get to Isaac, and by the time we get to Isaac, yes, that is the promised seed, but Abraham has done a lot to try to take the promise into his own hands. We see the Sarah and Hagar situation. He endangers that promise when immediately after this promise is given, and he shows up the land. He goes down to Egypt and tries to pass Sarah off, or Sarai at this point, off as his sister, which when Pharaoh takes her into his household, the promise of the seed is put in peril there. We see it again later in his life when he does the exact same thing. And again puts the seed in peril. We see with the Hagar situation where he's trying to fulfill the promise of the seed, and God reiterates, no, it is not through another, but it'll be through Sarah that this promised child is going to come. And of course, the promised child finally arrives and is immediately put in peril by God, in the sense that Abraham is asked to sacrifice him. And as was brought up in the discussion, it is afterwards, after Abraham is shown to be faithful, that we see a reiteration of the promise. If you go down to chapter 22 and start with verse 12, this is the angel of the Lord speaking on behalf of God to Abram. It says, "Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for I now know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." All right. And then we see down in verse 16, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you." And this is verse 17, "I will greatly bless you. I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven, as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So we see here in chapter 22, verse 17, a reiteration of that threefold promise of land, seed, and relationships characterized by blessing and curse. This is the only other place in Genesis where God really reiterates all three elements of the promise. Other places he reiterates one or the other, but here he's reiterating all three and saying, "I will surely do this now." So we do see here that Abraham has finally proven himself that he is faithful to God and he is obedient to God, that he fears him, and this is where God reiterates the promise that surely will happen. The rest of the story of Abraham is Abraham basically partially getting it right and partially getting it wrong. And as Logan pointed out, and when I asked him about was Abraham completely faithful when he left his father's house, he wasn't, because we see that that God says in verse 1, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house. He's supposed to leave his relatives in his father's house. But when it says, now Abraham in verse 4 went forth as the Lord has spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Uh, every detail that's included in the biblical material is important. It's there for a reason. We have to ask ourselves, why does the author tell us that Lot went with him? Uh, Now, Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his nephew. So here we have Sarah mentioned once, we have Lot mentioned twice. Why is Lot mentioned twice? Well, God told Abram, leave your relatives. Well, Lot went with him, and I think that's an important thing to understand, that Abram did not completely obey when he left, and this gets him in some trouble. He has to rescue Lot, and which he goes out of his way to rescue Lot. And he doesn't go out of his way to really protect Sarah. He passes her off as his sister, showing that seems to care more about Lot than he cares about his own wife, whereas God cares about Sarai and keeping his promise. And I think there's a distinction there, and it shows that Abram has a lot to learn. And this is all through his life. As David pointed out, that there are a lot of blunders in Abram's life, in Abraham's life, even in the midst of his faithfulness. It kind of fluctuates. He does something good, does something bad, does something good, does something bad, until eventually he gets it and proves that he gets it, in that he understands that I know God promised me this child. This child came, and I'm still going to trust that Yahweh will keep his word, keep his promise, even if I kill Isaac. He's willing to go all out and willing to demonstrate complete faithfulness, that Yahweh will be faithful to his word. And the lesson here, and I think the reason why this lesson is important, the reason why this is here, is that it demonstrates to the people of God that God is faithful to his word. Even when his own people are not faithful, God is faithful. And that when the people of God are not faithful, well, things don't go well. Abram puts the promise of the seed in peril with the birth of Ishmael, and to Hagar we have a problem that is still reverberating to this very day. The lesson here is that God is faithful, but when God's people are not, bad things happen. We should trust that the Lord will keep his word. And that does not give us an excuse to be unfaithful, because man is still held accountable for that. And I think that's a lesson we need to draw from the life of Abraham. We see this even in Joseph. We see that Joseph is faithful, Judah isn't, but Judah eventually comes around and shows obedience, but God is still faithful to his promises. And this is something we're going to see throughout the rest of the Pentateuch, this idea of God has promised land, seed, and a relationship with his people through Abraham and his seed. Will that be fulfilled, and will his people be faithful in return? This is a question we're going to see moving forward.